Greg Robinson, the Chief Curator of Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and I have a little story to tell. First, I'll briefly introduce Linda and Bob. I know many of you know them, but they'll tell more about themselves as we roll through the program. Linda Okazaki is our featured 10th anniversary retrospective artist. I'll tell that story. And it's been a great pleasure. I met Linda. I was aware of her work, but in the 80s and 90s, I was largely on the East Coast. And it was Max Grover who was one of the jurors for the very first show we did, summer of 2013. I think we had 6 of us jurying from all around the Puget Sound region. And Linda was on Max's list and was included in the very first show, First Light. And I think it's interesting how the title of this exhibition has evolved into the Light. And then Bob Haft, Professor Emeritus from Evergreen State College. And
The Evergreen State
College. And I know that they'll talk more about their longtime relationship and affinities with many things. This is BIMA's 10th anniversary year of being open. I was hired just a few years before that, and I have sort of joked in a couple of receptions for Cynthia Sears at Suite 16, because it took her a few years as our founder to come up with this idea and to see how we could get it rolling. When I was hired and we started to do the capital campaign, we went to different communities to see who might help us spread the message and maybe even host a reception or a party in their home. And it wasn't always smooth sailing around the Puget Sound region. If you remember, we started the campaign in 2010. 2008, that period, the economy was bad. There were other museums in the region that wondered, and other constituents in the region that wondered why we needed, did we need another art museum, why we needed one. Everyone knows, a lot of communities don't like a lot of change. There was something about Port Townsend that just sparked. The artists, of course, were receptive. We realized in the coming years that there was a great affinity with the Jefferson County Historical Museum, which has also had a name change to Art and History, and that there was just like a sister city thing that could happen that became quite electric. People offered to have receptions in their homes, and it was just kind of wonderful. And I asked Linda if she would, I could postpone. I always wanted to have a show with her, and in recent years we were talking about it, but I asked her if she could wait until the very end of the 10th anniversary year at BIMA, because it would be very special for me, having lived through that development history with planning Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, if we could end the anniversary year with her retrospective. That's why we're here this fall. That's why you're here today as opposed to a year ago or months ago. So I want to thank Port Townsend, especially Max Grover, and all of the enthusiasm you've all shared with Bainbridge Island and Bainbridge Island Museum of Art before and since. And of course now that we're also excited about a long-term ongoing relationship, all the great things we'll do together too in the future. So I just wanted to say that as opening words. I've asked Dasha Moore, who is relatively new on staff, about a year or so, to give our land acknowledgement. Dasha is a curatorial associate, and she's worked with me in detail with Linda, visiting the studio, taking all the notes, keeping track of the prolific portfolio history that Linda had, and also helping me to wrestle. I think at one point we were well over 100 pieces of art that could have been in the show. And then we said maybe 60, and Linda said maybe 90, and we said maybe 80, and Linda said maybe. It takes a while. What's available? And also, I want to thank those who've helped to really prepare some of the artwork. Some of the work being older, needed to be reframed. Linda Dugan, Brian Goodman, and various people who've helped to fund these efforts. So I'd like to introduce my right arm and left brain, Dasha Moore. Thank you.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to give the land acknowledgement, so here we go. We acknowledge the land on which we gather is within the Aboriginal territory of the Suquabs, people of clear salt water. Suquamish people, expert fishers, canoe builders, and basket weavers. The Suquabs live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquabs live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. We greatly appreciate the Suquamish tribe's involvement and support in 3 large Indigenous artist exhibitions in the past 10 years. Thank you.
So we will start now with the conversation.
Well, more than a year ago, I got a phone call from Greg Robinson and Amy Sawyer, and I had completely forgotten what Greg had suggested. And when they mentioned that they were considering my work for a retrospective at this time to honor the 10th anniversary, I was stunned and overwhelmed, and thought, oh my goodness. And then they began to explain what kind of support they would provide and explain their process. And I was thinking, oh, could I possibly do this? And this sounds quite interesting. And I am 76, and this sounded like the best prospect that had come my way. And that I better try to figure out how to get through those slides and floppy disks and hard drives and all the rest of it to put this inventory together to make it happen. And they told me the various ways that we would proceed, and I was excited, but sort of couldn't believe that this would be happening. And then they said, well, we'll be in touch. Do you have a working title? And all I could think of is what was suggested to me by another dear friend, Alan Maskin, who had seen the talk I gave at Smith and Valley, and he said, I think incomplete sentences is really pretty good. And I thought, perfect, because that's where I'm at. I just had piles of papers off to the left side of my painting table that needed organization. And my dear friend, Lisa Wood, that will be having a talk November 12th, she said, well, maybe you could begin to organize those and put them into different boxes, like maybe personal narrative and dream logic and earth, air, fire, water, and correspondence and inventory and theater, music, song, and so on and so forth. And I did that, and then they were like bales of hay. And then she said, maybe you could group those together. And then they got heaped, and they became more like a loaf of bread. And then I had, personal narrative and dream logic and Goethe's chromatic lessons and landscape and waterscape. And I was like, this is beginning to make sense. It feels like I've cleaned off my desktop, And so it was, and then I had the floor plan of the Pfefferman Gallery, and I began cutting these things to size and placing them around there and seeing, does this make sense? And what relates to the other thing? And look at that. So all along there were discoveries that I began to make, because I do work so much from an intuitive place, sometimes a dream place, sometimes just being captivated by something I've seen. But that process began to put things in order. And one of the things is that when I'm dreaming, there's this liminal space or the dream space where I would use lucid dreaming, where I'd wake up and make notes by the bedside, and then later, when I woke up, maybe I'd do an ink sketch with greater detail. Or sometimes the voice would be archaic. I knew it wasn't my voice, but I would make note of those words and wonder, well, where did that come from? And I thought that maybe we could make some broadsides and put it by the side of a few paintings. But then when I looked at it, I thought, well, that would look a little jumbled. And a lot of times people move through exhibits and don't really have time to consider that sort of thing. And so Greg said, well, it would be perfectly fine if you wanted to put a little chapbook together and it could be separate. So that's what happened with the help of Carrie Tremaine, putting this work together and publishing it for me. And now I have 9 notes and visions, and it's a selection of those works that I had done, just 9 of them. And by no means do I consider myself a poet, because I know what poets do for their life to make that happen. But to me, painting without poetry is nothing. So I'll take this opportunity to read a few of these, and then we'll talk about another part of this exhibit that's so important for the contemporary work. On the left, you see Blanche and the Fisher King from 1981, and that's in the flat files of the Northwest Collection at Seattle Art Museum. And on the right is the painting Evening Departure that is in the exhibit. And you can see on the right how the figures are still there, but on the left they took on more their archetypal or trickster greater personality, but they are related, and this poem speaks to both of them. Night Crossing. How you find me, hold still. Ask of me the simple question, where is the wound? Will it heal? Enigmatic stranger, bound by your presence, to hear the unheard sound of desire. You are headed where I came from. I am going where you have been. Tell me your name.
Linda, I just want to add, when you talked about, I've never seen an artist take the scale drawing of the Pfefferman Gallery, take every single painting that we could possibly find, wherever it was, and group them and have them all cut and on little stands to size. And I said to her, because I have to deal with the real logistics, I said, are these anywhere near to scale? And she said, certainly. She passed me the handwritten paper that her husband, Ray, had done with the formula to convert every single frame to scale. And I thought, this might end up being a little easier. She's very complicated as an artist and a person, but the logistics of this show might be a lot easier than many. So thank you very much.
Well, thank Ray. Yeah, I need his math brain, too. I would never have been able. I was trying to figure it out, and it was like, Ray, could you help me here? It's like, yeah, this is. So that was how that was done. This is Eclipse on the left-hand side. That painting is the complete image and not in the exhibit. And I've always loved the eclipse and events in our atmosphere, planets that line up, and the comet that goes by that we won't see again for another 100 or 80 years if we live that long. And I think that we are drawn to that kind of mysterious aspect to our lives and our what we experience. On the right-hand side is the bird that's below the eclipsed sun, only flying the other direction around the room. And just for note, because of how Bima saved me, when I originally painted this bird, I had it heavily loaded with rosy carmine and rose d'or that are fugitive colors. And I sort of did it as a test. It looked sort of like a Barbie house. And, but people still liked it, the pink and all of that. But when I saw it recently, 40 years later, it looked perfect because all of that had faded. And then, so the Bainbridge Island Museum of Art has replaced the plexiglass with UV glass that will protect my artwork into the future. And my appreciation is beyond comment. This work would have been lost. And I didn't know that myself until I had this opportunity to see it in life. So the notes: eclipse. Birds chatter, limbs shake leaves, silence with mysterious weight, the wind dies, passion's moment extends time, archaic time of sacrifice and offering, beat on mirrors and drums of your heart, pushing towards something new. River Story, 1989 on the left, is not in the exhibit, but River Story Return on the right is. And River Story Return happened a decade later because I felt that something had changed. I needed to revisit what happened in the initial story that was a dream. Rising quickly to the surface in the rushing, muddy high water, pushed against the banks, objects come up for me. One glass vessel, not broken. Light violet rose. Another and yet another. I swim. Obsidian bird churned up out of the mud into my arms and onto the landing. A crowd gathers, and he drops one which shatters. We must summon the tribal leader. Do not leave. Walking Robe understands I am of this place. All stilled by dance and song, I left with the gifts. Garden at Crèvecoeur, 1992. The painting is in the exhibit. A thin vibration moves against the surface. Point to point, touch-tone reality vanishes. Simpatico. On stage below, the viola d'amore waits for hand to strike the surface as music began. In the garden at Crèvecoeur, waiting silently for the figure to transcend the stone, two crows give voice. Cloo, clock, crack, come back. Mournful sound moves the heart. Compression tears to the sides of the rock. Inside note, outside vibration. Point-to-point reality. The stone in its mutable form is water. Sculpting in the House of the Ancients, 1993. This painting is not in the exhibit, but I include it because I felt like I was a Buddhist from the time that I was 12. I don't know why. There was a person that came to the door and handed me a book of Buddhism. I didn't know who the person was, and he left. I was just 12. And I continue to learn, and I think one of the things I like about Buddhism is you don't have to wait 600 years for Galileo to be accepted. They stay up to, part of the teaching is you have to stay present with new scientific discoveries. And so it's quite a rigorous endeavor. Stepping into dream time, the procession along the water's edge, following the deer I met before, along the creek leading the way, my steps not far behind, Everyone treat with respect and echo a family prayer of earth protection. The whole create a living Buddha to depend upon, a night watch with soul spirit weak and unstable, crafting importance out of pink mud, red rose of the womb cry out, weep, pity the sorcerer and small deer to manage, art to heal. And the last one here, Dream at Salt Creek, 1994. Now this is also the backdrop to Birds Take Flight into Twilight. I imagined it as an opera that I'm working on, so I think we have to have outlandish ideas. And that's where I'm at. Those who make artifact, sleeping under cedar boughs, the story comes. Salt Creek, waters fresh and salty, commingle to make old campground. In the dreaming longhouse, filled with people, all carving, painting, fabrication with hands, minds, surfaces, rich stories, gifts, bearing sentiment. I am instructed to go to the people across the creek. They have lost their stories, language of their culture, masks, paintings, artifact. Those who have the gift, share with your people. It is for everyone to create their story. So thank you.
We will, I guess we'll do Q&A afterwards with everybody.
Yes.
And now I'm going to ask Bob Haft to talk a little bit about, how, first of all, how he knows Linda, for how long, and why we're here today. And then he also has his own work to discuss as well.
Well, first I'd like to thank you all for coming, but most I'd like to thank Linda, or I wouldn't be here, in more ways than one. I wasn't destined by any stretch of the imagination to be an artist when I was in college. I was a scientist, supposedly, and my undergraduate degree was in psychology, and I was going to go into medicine, I thought. But I met Linda and her husband in 1969, and for some reason they befriended me, although I never am quite sure why. I'll have to ask you. But they took me under their wing, and frankly, her husband is responsible for me getting into graduate school as an artist, and it changed my life, the trajectory of my life, much for the better, I can assure you. I would have been an abysmal doctor. But I think I'm a fair artist, so I think that was a good exchange. We met, again, 54 years ago, but my favorite story, I think I can tell it in this audience, about Linda came when we were in graduate school. And WSU gave us all the opportunity to teach as graduate students, which paid us a stipend, which was wonderful. But we all had to teach Art 101, which was the most basic and the most sort of pathetic art course you could take. And there were lots of kids in Eastern Washington who really weren't interested, I can say that. So I was in my studio one day, and Linda burst into my office, and she's in tears. She's just weeping, and she's emotionally overwrought. And I said, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" And she kept saying, "They're going to fire me. They're going to fire me." And I thought, what's going on? And I said, "What happened?" She said, "Well, I was looking out at this mass of students, and they were all had this dull expression on their face." And I said, "What do you think I am, a fucking TV?"
Oh, no.
My reaction was like yours. I started laughing, which probably didn't do what she was hoping for, some sympathetic ear. But I said, no, you won't be fired for that, I'm sure of it. That's probably the best thing that happened to that group. And I'm sure it was to this day. So when she approached me about being up here today, I thought that I was going to be in the position of Greg talking to Linda about her paintings, which have fascinated me for 50 years. But she turned it around. Again, I think it's that generosity of her spirit and of artist spirit in general that suddenly she wanted me up on the stage talking about my work. That wasn't part of the bargain when we originally set this up. But I'm quite willing to do it.
Great. Linda, we have some, it's the Briarcliff series. I just wanted to give a little context about the back and forth of this today.
Yes, I needed a little bit of break too. And the reason that happened is that I followed David Boehm's, who's a physicist, his idea about creativity and dialogue. So I really like dialogue among artists more than just one person speaking, because I think it opens up this conversation, and I find art to be so conversational. So the Briarcliff series was something that, and it's not as long as the reading, but it was, I knew that I needed to work backwards if I wanted to have new work for the exhibit. And so last July 2022, I spent the month of July in Magnolia working on these iPad paintings having to do with friendly shrubs and water traffic, the atmosphere, the light in the sky and water related to Goethe's chromatic lessons. And
just for a little context, I went to Briarcliff Elementary School, which sits on top of the second hill in Magnolia. So when I had never heard of a Briarcliff series, but I knew where she was talking. And the friendly shrubs, if you have spent a lot of time in Magnolia, there's still a history of a lot of the landscaping where things get shaped, and so that's the context for this.
And each house seems to have their own personality that's so distinct. And on the right, I think that, how you get mixed, is a snapshot from Bob Helm's studio later after the Briarcliff series, which was an imaginary conversation with a dear friend and colleague, and Bob Helm, who had also been my graduate instructor. He died unexpectedly in 2008, and his studio has been closed all this time. And his wife, Tamara, and his daughter, Brenna, invited us to visit his studio. I was overwhelmed. I had no idea that would be offered. And when I stepped in, of course, I was completely filled with emotion, not really having grieved the loss, and seeing his work and things so familiar, and the way we used to have conversations that, well, how did you get your idea? Well, I think the best way to get an idea is put your left foot in a bucket of warm water on the porch. And, and he would sometimes set out to, I'm going to drive for 7 miles in any direction, and then I'll work on whatever happens to be there. So he had these different techniques. So my idea to have a conversation with Bob Helm was a way to enliven the shrubbery, because I could imagine a conversation and then things happen. So on the left is falling water friendly shrub. And that was just like going up to this place and this simple thing happening and feeling embraced by reflections on an earlier time. This is Coyote on the move, and the coyotes in Briarcliff are fatter than the ones at North Beach in Port Townsend, because they've been eating small domestic animals. And the chickens during COVID, the people in Briarcliff started having chickens, which was kind of unusual, but it became a thing. And so the coyotes were, well fed. And this one, he grabbed Bacon, our family dog.
Oh, no.
And had him Bacon in his mouth running down the street. And my son Luke came running out, yelling and screaming. He's a big guy. And the coyote got scared and dropped Bacon, thank goodness. And Bacon was injured, but he did recover. But I did see that coyote going by. That was a favorite. Westmont was a favorite place for him.
So Luke saved his bacon.
Yeah, that's right. And now we're very careful about how we let Bacon out because he's a treasure. He's not bright, but he's lovable. Yeah. And this one, looking at Tahoma, Mount Rainier, that's been a long-standing theme of mine from Japanese woodblock prints. So I've been doing that since the 80s. Not that I have that many, but I'm always drawn to it, the majesty, the way you can see it from so many points of view. So beautiful, whether you're in an ugly place or a beautiful place. And then the sculptural part of the shrubbery framing it. And then this dog walking by in the heat of the day. So it was just a scene that I was drawn to, nothing more. And this is a reference to Goethe's chromatic lessons, that the atmosphere and the light. And I've been drawing iPad paintings of Briarcliff since 2017, looking at the light and this and that. I've been fascinated by it because it's the perfect view with the atmosphere, the Olympic Mountains, the water traffic, and then this point of view. So it really is the perfect spot to observe those things. And this was when we had some particulate in the air. So now that that's happening, we're all becoming observers of the atmosphere and the particulate in the air. And how has that changed? And with Goethe's chromatic lessons, he talks about as things darken, it's layers of red darkening and darkening until it gets dark. Well, these green dots are actually the after image on the retina from looking at the sun going down. And then it goes boom like that. But I noticed with Alex Katz's retrospective at the Guggenheim that he also had a painting that was similar to this in the last year of his painting, and he said, "Well, this is what old people do," and people said, "Well, why is it so messy?" And he says, "Well, you only have a few seconds to paint it. What do you expect?" And so I thought, well, we're on the same page here. That's great. And then one of the other things that I really loved was the way that the ferry traffic goes 28 times a day or so. Mm-hmm. So I was fascinated and continue to be fascinated with the ferry moving into the Bainbridge ferry landing and then over to Seattle. It was like a rope, a cord connecting the two. And I loved to watch the two ferries passing and when they passed and how it worked. And the regatta boats, how do they find their way through? And sometimes there'd be big cruise ships or other things that were a part of the traffic. And then the boats anchored close to shore waiting to offload grain or to be filled. So there was always some story to tell, and then the dramatic weather that could change. And the last one here, the cruise ships coming into Homeport and the ferry again and nighttime. So I would get up sometimes in the middle of the night to see what was going on, see if I could catch anything. And oftentimes there was something, and because it's the iPad, I could make a sketch within a half hour pretty easily. once I got the hang of it. And what I liked about the cruise ships, I would never be on one because it's just not my thing, but I always like watching them take off and arrive. I like the shape or something about it. And then I noticed if a cruise ship is leaving and we're about to leave, that when we get back to home, our home, and look out to North Beach, that same cruise ship will be passing. And I love that. Oh, that means that. So it was just these observations are interesting to me.
Linda's one of the most studious, maybe the most studious artist I've really ever worked with. And that's, I think, saying a lot. What I loved about this experience is she's house sitting for her son and daughter-in-law for 6 weeks, was it? And she would tell people, she's just not house sitting. You see what she does with her time. She is an artist in residence, and that's how she explains it. And convey the running into the women in the neighborhood.
Oh yeah, I was, I had a camera and taking pictures, and Briarcliff does have a lot of theft. So if you're getting Amazon deliveries, you like to, and you're out of town, you have a neighbor who's going to pick up for you and that sort of thing. They work as a good neighborhood. But I was taking pictures at this one place, and the woman walked right out of, and what is it that you're doing? And I said, oh, I'm an artist in residence here in Briarcliff, and I'm studying friendly shrubs. and here's my here's my card. And then also I like to talk to the crows, or not the crows so much, but now the ravens at home, that we have a relationship. They've been trying to teach me the water sound for years that I haven't capped. I can do it a little bit, but not very well. But I do call out, caw, caw, caw. And I saw some ravens up there in Briarcliff, and I called out to them, caw, caw, caw. And they dive bombed me. And I had to put up my iPad, and it was like, oh, I know it's the wrong neighborhood to know these guys. And so it was like, oh, so I was trying out different stuff because it was clearly a different neighborhood than what I know. And I loved having an opportunity to get to know some of the people and for them to get to know the dog that I was walking and to see that there's a commonality and where their interests were and their great generosity toward needy children to be included in all the sports and different things that we can be caught in stereotypic ideas. And I loved my experience to be able to expand my understanding.
Thank you, Linda, very much. And now Bob is going to pull us kind of way, way back, and where we're safe from coyotes and crows and all of that. And we're going to go on a different, but you'll see, somewhat parallel journey.
Well, before we do, I just again want to thank Linda, because we have had dialogues for 50 years, literally. And the most fun thing for me is just talking to another artist like her. When I wake up in the morning at 3 o'clock, my mind is going 90 miles an hour. Hers is going that 24/7, So when you meet with her and talk with her, she's just like a fount of ideas are coming out, and it's inspiring to be around you. So if you could bring the lights down even more, I'm pretty used to working in the dark, and so it might be easier to see some of these things. But this image is from graduate school from 1973, I guess, and that's fine, just perfect. As I mentioned before, I had no business being in graduate school in fine arts, absolutely none. And because of that, I also was dreaming a lot. And prior to this, my best dreams were the ones where I could fly, where if I was in trouble, I could just lift off and take off and sail away until I forgot how to do that, and then I'd crash, of course. But when I got into graduate school and I realized I shouldn't have been there, I was psychologically grounded. I couldn't fly in my dreams anymore, and it was very disorienting, and it was traumatic, to say the least. So in Eastern Washington, Linda and I both like birds. There are a lot of birds that you can see that are dead. And there are a lot of them here, too, on this half of the state, but there's just so many trees around that we don't see them. And this is true. I'm not making this up. An ornithologist friend told me about this. So I kept finding these dead birds, and I had a friend who was learning to hang glide, and I just loved the juxtaposition of those two things, a man trying to fly and birds that couldn't anymore. And so I put this together, and it was a form of art therapy. It was healing for me. And I did this series, which taught me to work in series. And the more I did these, the better I felt about myself being in school. And so this is all about, this first one is about memory. So memory, time, and place are the three subjects that we agreed that we would talk about in our talk. So this starts memory. And I'm going to come back to this thing about being grounded later on. But before we move on to the next one, I just want to say one other thing about when I started to teach at the Evergreen State College, I had a mentor there, a guy named Pete Sinclair, who was just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And we were teaching together. That was one of the nice things about teaching at Evergreen was you team taught. So I learned from other teachers, essentially. And Pete one day asked me, Bob, do you know how we learn things? Which I thought was the stupidest question imaginable, because I was 32, and I thought, of course I know how we learn things. But then I thought, I better not say I do, because I think Pete knows more than I do about this. And so I said, no, Pete, how do we learn? And he said, we tell each other stories. And that just stunned me. It was so simple, and yet so perfectly true. So that became my teaching pedagogy, was telling stories, and that's probably what I'm going to do to you today, is just tell stories, if that's all right. So we can go to the next one. And this is also about memory, but it's also about paying homage to another artist and having a dialogue with another artist. So the images you see repeated there a couple of times are photographs from one of my mentors, who of course I never met, a French photographer named Henri Cartier-Bresson, and I admired his work. And so this was an effort to pay homage to him when I saw his work in this, I think it was a secondhand store in Seattle. And I liked his original piece is about reflection, so my dialogue with him was to make a reflection of a reflection, and then that's a selfie of me in the corner there, just feeling like being in the presence of greatness and being childlike in my wonderment of that. And this one I made before I was still an undergraduate. And I had the great good fortune to go to Avignon, which Linda did too subsequently, as a study abroad student. And I lived with a French family there that was just marvelous. I had never taken photographs up to this point, except with the little box camera that I got, and it was all the pictures were more or less snapshots. So this is the first non-snapshot I think I ever made. And it is about memory. You can see the old man there who's probably my age now, or I'm maybe older than he. And there's this false memory that I've learned that we all carry with us. And that's figured in that painting of Napoleon, which is just a piece of propaganda, essentially. But I love the man's body language, his demeanor, and then the size, the scale of him in relationship to this, essentially this big lie up there. And it looked to me like he was looking back at something. And we can go to the next one. This is, to me, is memory personified. It's a staircase in a cathedral in Lyon, France. And it reminded me of Yeats's poem, The Second Coming, turning and turning in the widening gyre. But for me, memory now, as old as I am, is turning, not widening, but it's narrowing. I find I have fewer and fewer memories of things, but they go way, way back. And it's also a reminder to me that I suffer, and I'm sure some of you do too, from something called l'esprit d'escalier, which is a French phrase which means the spirit of the staircase. And it refers to that phenomenon when you've just come out of a job interview or out of a talk like this, and you're walking down the staircase, and you go, oh, I forgot to say the most important thing. That's the spirit of the staircase. It always hits you too late, which I'm sure will happen when I mount the stairs today to see Linda's show. We can go to the next. So this next four, these deal with time. And this is a photo of my son when he was 3, I think, 4 maybe. And the story behind it is I was taking a picture of that wall behind him with the Mexican rug hanging above it because I'd never seen the texture of that wall before. The light was coming in the window at such an angle in the late summer that it just astounded me that it wasn't a blank white wall. It was full of texture. And so I was photographing that, and my son kept coming into the light. And that's what the title of this one is, Into the Light. And so it resonates with the title of Linda's show. And I kept moving him away. I kept saying, get out of here, I'm working. Don't you see what I'm doing? And so he moved twice for me, and then he came back a third time. And that idea of the third time being the charm is really true. And it was like the Zen master when they take you a ruler and bop you on the head, you know, an instant enlightenment. And I saw suddenly, oh, that's what I'm supposed to be photographing, not this stupid wall, but, you know, the beauty of the light on my son here. And then he wouldn't come back, you know, so then he was, so. This one, Linda said it reminds her of the one about that she just showed from the Briarcliff series of those after images of sun that you see. This is all about time and memory. It's a combination of the two. So when I started this series, which began with that last photograph, I had been looking, I think as all artists do, for what do I make art about? And I never had a problem running dry somehow, you know, having writer's block or anything. And they always tell writers, well, write about what you know. And it occurred to me after I made that last photograph, I should be photographing what I know. And my kids were always around, always right in front of me. And I realized that's the best subject matter you've got. You know them better than anything else. And they got so used to me with a camera that I became invisible to them, you know. So I just followed them everywhere and did this series called The Joys and Terrors of Childhood, which put me back in touch with my own childhood and my misremembering of things. So this photo comes from Walla Walla and my father's barn, which I had remembered as being the most wonderful place. And I wanted to take my kids there, and you can see their reaction. It's like a catatonic stupor. And as soon as I saw that, I realized, oh yeah, that place used to scare the shit out of me too. I had totally forgotten that. So this series, as I say, it reminded me of how we gloss over so many things in our lives. And our dialogue has included memories of Linda's that are, you know, are scathing to me. And my childhood seemed so bright and airy in comparison until I started seeing things like this and remembering stuff. So the next one, I've gotten into a lot of trouble with this photograph, unfortunately, but it's one of those things that reminds me that when I showed it, members in an audience, half of them will lionize you for it, and the other half will demonize you for it. You know, they say you're such a terrible person for making that. Well, it's just something that I saw. And I've often thought, I can't help what I see, in more ways than one, I suppose. But I was driving home from work, and I saw this. My daughter tied up, standing in this wagon, rope around her neck, and the other two kids are out in front of her with swords fighting. And the only way they would let her play with them is if she was the prize, you know. So they put her in this wagon, and I've shown this often. And some students at the Evergreen State College wanted to use it as the cover of a literary magazine. I said, sure, go ahead. So a couple weeks after that, I got a call from Amnesty International. I'm not kidding. And they said, we've seen the photograph. And I thought, what are they talking about? What are they constantly talking about? And this guy went on and on. I said, what do you mean? He said, the photograph of your daughter tied up, you know, like a slave or something. I said, oh my God. I said, do you have kids? And he said, no. And I said, well, you're well-intentioned, but badly misinformed. And I hung up on Amnesty International. So this next one, again, is about time, but it's about dream time. And again, this is my daughter, and it's, the expression on her face was something that I just fell in love with, but also that there's two images in this you can see. There's something in the foreground, something in the background, which is another thing I wanted to talk to Linda about, because so many of her paintings have exactly that kind of spatial relationship where you can focus on many things at once. And this is just a beautiful, beautiful image, but it also, it seems to me about the transition from childhood to adolescence. And that last photograph reminds me that all of us are lucky to have survived our adolescence, you know, the stupid things we did as kids. So we can go to the next one. And this comes from 1993. So this is 24 years after I had been a student in France. And my French mother had a family with 6 children, and I come from a family of 7. So I fit right in, and I fell in love with her, and I kept writing her after I left, I'm coming back one day, I'm coming back one day. But over those 24 years, I lost more and more of that ability to speak French and to write fluently in it. But I finally made it back 24 years later, and France had changed so completely. And I was overwhelmed emotionally, intellectually, by sights, smells, sounds, the language, everything was just too much. So I was trying to make photographs that show what that felt like. It was a real attempt to make art that shows other people how you feel. And in some ways, it was also visual puzzles. So if you cover up the right-hand side of this thing, there's a little black line down the middle. That's one photo of the Eiffel Tower, a picture of it. And then the next image over was the next image on a roll of film. So they were side by side. And I realized that made much more sense visually to me than either one of those singly did. And again, it was sort of like a puzzle. And a part of art, I think, is to educate your audience to some degree, you know, to elevate them, hopefully, to a better understanding of how to look at things. Most people, as Linda's husband and Miles's father taught me, most people use their eyes as defense mechanisms. And as a photographer, I have learned to use them quite differently. You know, I'm not afraid to look at things that other people turn away from. Roadkill, for instance, you know, it's fascinating. So let's go to the second one. This was, the one on the left was taken in a little town called Souillac. And in addition to becoming an artist, I became more or less an art historian. That's what I taught at Evergreen. And that statue is from the 12th century, and it's Isaiah, prophet. And I just fell in love with it, looking at pictures of it when I was studying. It's a Romanesque statue. And so I made a pilgrimage to this little town where this was, just to photograph that statue. And that's another thing we have in common, is I think we both love to make pilgrimages, either to sites where other artists that we know and love have lived, or something has happened in their lives. So I took that photograph, I went outside, and there was a street fair going on in the church parking lot, and there was this guy selling chickens, and I took that photograph, had no clue that they're exactly the same thing, 7 centuries apart. But it made me also realize that when I work, when I photograph, and I think this is true of a lot of photographers, I have sort of visual matrix that you try to impose on the world. And I must have been carrying that around and kept trying, kept trying to get that same imposition of ideas and composition together. So the next one, please. This is about time, place, and memory. And this is the cloister in Arles, another place that we've both made pilgrimages to. And the one on the left shows my 3 kids, my son and my 2 daughters. And my wife was over on the right, out where the sun is, and she called my name, and I turned to her and answered whatever question she did, and then turned back and took that second picture again, and didn't realize until I developed the roll of film, it was the same thing, but 80 years had passed, and my son had died or disappeared, and my daughters had turned into these 2 old women. And again, I was just struck by the incongruity of that, and yet the perfect nature of it at the same time. So then we can go to the final one here, and this is a memento mori, which is something that artists often make. It's about remind you of the inevitability of death. And the one on the left is from Avignon. Took my kids to the Palais des Papes, Papal Palace, and there was this horrific sculpture of this skeleton there, and you can see they're beat. I mean, I dragged my kids into museums and tried to get them to like them as much as I did, and I was successful eventually, as I learned much later in life. And then the one that's right to the right of it was on a train. We were on a train, and I reached up to grab my backpack, and my camera fell out. It was the most important thing in my life, and I grabbed it, and it took my picture. So that's an inadvertent selfie, but it seemed to make perfect sense with that image on the left. They're both memento mori, reminding us both of our transient nature on the earth. So that's it for me. And
Thank you, Bob, very much. I thought we could open it up to questions and comments, and we do have a reception afterwards. We invite all of you to come upstairs to Linda's retrospective. We'll have some food and drink. And just before so I don't forget, there's a couple of things I'd like to say. Linda, could you hold up your chapbook?
Oh, sure.
This is the booklet that Linda's talking about. It is available in the Bema store and also in Port Townsend through Linda. And the Briarcliff series, it's comprised of 20 iPad paintings that then are worked over with watercolor. And Linda produced a limited edition print that is also available. So you can look for that. And we have 12 of the 20 framed Briarcliff paintings, so you can actually see those in the exhibition. She mentioned the November 12th talk with Dr. Lisa Fort-Louis Wood, and if you just wouldn't mind raising your hand, so you know that she's here. And Miles, it's a thrill to have you here. Miles Okazaki, Linda's son from New York. So thank you.
A big surprise.
Yeah. And now let's open it up to questions, comments. And if if we have a hard time hearing your question, I'll just repeat it, okay? Anyone have any? Yes?
Bob, can you shed a little more light for me on the Isaiah prophet and the chickens being sold? I'm lost with that comparison being the same.
Did everyone hear the question? Okay, I'm wanting a little more information from Bob on the Isaiah prophet and the chickens being sold.
Well, if you can go back just to look at it, it's the exact same composition. You see that, I hope?
So he's got his arm up, and the chickens represent the shield?
Well, just that doorway and that space, a spatial relationship. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for the chickens, there's not a lot of light at the end of that tunnel. But I think I see your point. Are there other questions or comments? Yes.
Linda, the aura vacui in many of your paintings with the fear of emptiness, is there anything related to your personal experience?
A fear of emptiness? Oh, do you think? I hadn't thought of that before. I thought I had.
Do you feel like you're afraid of empty space, that you have to fill all your image with lots of motif, repeated motif?
Oh, yeah, the horror vacui thing.
Yeah.
Oh. See, I'm not sure. Maybe I'll become a minimalist. Just to I have a future now that you've brought this out. I've been wondering what I might do in my future now that I understand my work better.
I want to thank Linda for sharing. There are 3 paintings upstairs. They're from the series. One of the names of the series is The Mother Wound, and they are about her mother being murdered when she was 6 years old. And, working with an artist over the course of a year plus, it's an interesting journey because the artist reveals more and more, and we get to where we can begin to understand what audiences may really want to know more about. And we kind of negotiate that and work that through. But I want to just say that it was a lot of difficult content for Linda to share, and I really, really appreciate that she let Dasha and I into that conversation and didn't shut it down. And some of these paintings have never been framed or shown in the public realm, and I just want to thank you very much.
Well, I thank you because I felt very insecure about it. I decided I didn't want to go there. And now that I have talked about things and I realized how that event informed almost all of this other work. And so with that missing, there isn't the depth of understanding for myself or for the viewer. I was afraid that it might appear to be somewhat self-indulgent emotionally in some way. And so it did end up to be good for me as well.
Can I say a couple things about that? When you and I have talked in the past, your paintings to me are loaded with symbolism. They're obviously symbolic, but they're not symbolically obvious. I don't know what a lot of the symbols mean, and I so enjoy not knowing what a lot of the symbols mean. So I meant to get back to this when I said I'd get back to grounding. If someone tries to explain to me sometimes what a painting means or what a photograph means, I'd rather not know. It's like those poetry classes in high school where you were supposed to analyze a poem and then the teacher told you were wrong. I'm sorry, no, that doesn't work.
Just to let one experience it, sort of, and I've had people come up to me and tell me their story of what they're seeing, and I've really enjoyed that because I could believe that, yes, this is your experience, and that was illuminating for me to have that expansion of the experience. So the viewer is very much a part of what makes these things come alive for me.
A few of us were upstairs before this talk, and I remember saying I wasn't sure if these were, I was describing some of the paintings, but I wasn't sure if these were things you had actually told me, or now I'm just kind of off projecting, further. And Bob, Linda, first of all, I love how you honor influences, Van Gogh, and not just, his life, but the use of color, what color means to you. And there's your college professor, Galen Hansen, and some influences even in your work. And a lot of artists aren't that specific about honoring those who've influenced. I'm just wondering, Bob, you mentioned a famous photographer, but did you also have professors or other influences that are important to you?
Yeah, definitely. Arthur Okazaki, my mentor in more ways than one, definitely had a profound influence on the way I see the world. And as I think any artist has to be aware of other artists working. And I taught photography and I taught art history so long that I have a pretty vast repertoire, visual repertoire. And so I often make photographs that are directly in homage to another photographer. Robert Frank, for instance, or Robert Doisneau, a lot of French photographers, Auger. But yeah, and then there are just people in my life that I want to honor. My parents, for instance. I've made photographs that have tried to honor specific individuals. But again, unless it's titled, you don't know who that is. And so this gets back to Bob Helm. I asked Helm once, how do you come up with your titles? Because they were so off the wall. I mean, just, what is this? He said, I just open a book and put my finger on a sentence and that's it. Well, it's a surrealistic trope, but it works very well. So.
I'll try that. Good idea.
Another question or comment? Yes? We'll take, why don't you go first? Yeah.
Well, mine is more of an observation. It's for Bob and Linda. And that thing about talking about giving credence to other artists, and Greg, maybe you sort of brought that up. But that does, do you think that happens as we all age and go through? Because it used to be that if you, or I believe this to be true, is when we were all graduate students, humping through stuff, the idea that you might be derivative of someone's work seemed like, oh God, what's with you? But in fact, it seems to me, where I found this with my work, is that as I progressed in the years, it seems like, oh, I think I'm getting more generous in my life. Because I have that person kind of hand in hand in my studio as I work. And I wondered if that's kind of, Greg, what you were hitting on, and if Bob and Linda, do you have that, do you agree with that, or what do you think?
Well, when I taught, I told students, these are three, this is a piece of advice to give to jazz musicians. Imitate, integrate, innovate. And so when I started, I imitated Ansel Adams. I just loved his work. But I had a little box camera that couldn't focus anything, and just had a one-speed shutter. So you try to emulate artists who you like, and in graduate school, yeah, you're told, no, you shouldn't be derivative. But now if somebody tells me, oh, your work looks like a Cartier-Bresson, boy, that makes me really happy.
Well, yes, I have the line of books of artists that I love and admire so much, and they come in to have visual conversations with me, and there's never enough time, but I know in this trip coming up October 22nd to go to Brooklyn, there's Ed Ruscha show. I'm looking forward to smelling that chocolate room and experiencing that. And then there's a Degas and Manet show at the Met. Wow. And I love going with the iPad and studying something. I just love that because I always learn something, and I'm going to go do the Olympia Manet and study that, and that's influential on the vacation painting upstairs. And so having that opportunity, and the thing is, I don't know if you believe it or not, but I actually get to talk to those artists when I'm painting.
Yeah.
Really great conversations.
After a year or so working with you, I believe it, honestly. And there was a question in the middle.
Yes, I had a question for Linda. You made a comment early in the presentation about the connection between painting and poetry and how significant and important the poetry portion is. You said painting without poetry is nothing. Could you expand on that? How do you see that?
I think for me that they come in my process, that they come from that similar place where with a poem, you can't really say exactly what it is with Lorca or with Borges or who, I can't think of who I might call to mind exactly, but, or Merwin. You're reading it and he has viscosity of shadow. And then I discover, oh, he was good friends with Einstein. Mm. And so isn't that kind of interesting, that viscosity of shadow, what could that be? So it just stirs up the imagination to go to places that maybe you haven't visited, other realms to explore. And in that sense, the poetry, whether it's with music or poem or painting, they occupy this liminal space of improvisation where you don't quite know where you're headed. You have an idea, but you don't know exactly. And then after you've done it, you don't know exactly if you got there. So maybe you go back and you paint over it. And so poetry can be a bit metaphysical as well, where, oh, it was this, and then it became that, and then it became this. And with mine, you don't have to use those special fancy things to look through with infrared or whatever, because I've taken pictures of all of them before I paint new layers on.
Wow. Can I say one last thing? And that's the difference in the way we work. Yours is entirely additive, right? You start with a blank canvas and include things, and mine is entirely subtractive. I start with a world and I have to exclude things. And yet I think we arrive at the same point somehow, you know? Well.
Before we go upstairs, and I will ask if there are more questions, but one of the docents, Ruth, I don't know if it was your question the other day, someone left one of your very intriguing trainings and asked, tell us a little more about the Frida Kahlo painting. And I'm going to give everyone a homework assignment. As you go upstairs, take a look at that and think about her answer here. There was you had talked about teaching in Pullman when you were...
I started a Women in Art course. It was the second wave of feminism, and I love art history. So it started from Hildegard von Bingen, who was a visionary and had ideas about color theory, the greening of the imagination, and on down to contemporary times. And so certain women artists really stood out as important in my feeling confident in telling my story. And one of the regional would have been Faye Jones in the early 70s. I saw those small paintings that she had, and they had such a magical quality. And Joan Brown from California, the big pieces of her dancing or swimming to Alcatraz, or, and they were kind of stilted in a way that was interesting and powerful with the color. And Leonora Carrington and a couple of other surrealists were really important for me because they told their story, and it was distinctly different from being a realist or a romanticist or a minimalist or a constructivist or any of those. It was a woman telling her story and gave it credence and validity. And so with Frida, she really told her story, and I found her paintings much more compelling to me than Diego Rivera's, which seemed kind of, by comparison, beautiful. A number of them I found quite beautiful, but they felt kind of wooden. They didn't have that emotional content. And so those artists really, they were just like, you can do this. It's distinctly different, and it doesn't have to be a school of thought. It can be this other thing.
Any other questions? No? Yes.
Could you tell how you signed some of your work, Blanche Avalanche?
Yes, Blanche Avalanche, and I seem to be on the edge of things a few times. And Ruby Knuckles was another one that they gave me. And evidently she was a woman who had quite a reputation in the Ozarks that my uncle Mace knew about. He says, I think Ruby Knuckles would be a good name for you. And I still rather like the name, but then one of the women of the village told me, she didn't have a very good reputation. I thought, well, yeah. I'm sure they're all dead now, so I could bring it back and nobody would know the better of it.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and please join us upstairs. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.